How about now? Testing, testing, 1, 2, 3. Excellent. Okay, we're good.
I would, yeah, I'd go back there again.
Saturday.
Okay, everyone, we're going to get started. The Zoom is working. The speaker is here. The slides are up. It's a miracle. It is truly a miracle. You know, when I introduce our speakers, you've all seen their bios in the announcement, so I don't go into any great detail other than it's not too many times where we get the past chief historian of NASA. And before that, he was the chief historian of Military Airlift Command, which of course was the Air Force agency before it changed to AMC, responsible for airlift, and which of course is what the Berlin Airlift was. As a career airlifter myself, I love to point out to people that the Berlin Airlift was the only direct confrontation between the US and the Soviet Union during the Cold War. And to paraphrase Leon Uris in his book Armageddon, we won it and we did it with airplanes. We did it with airplanes, transport airplanes. So with that, everyone, Roger Launius.
Hey. All right. Yeah. Hi, everybody. I'm Roger Launius. Some of you probably have seen my bio, and that's great. But just let me give you a thumbnail of this because I've had several careers. All of them have been great, related to air and space. None of them are in the engineering world. I never could handle the mathematics, or I would have been one of you all. But the reality is, I became a historian. And I really wasn't an aerospace historian initially. I did my PhD work at LSU. Cheers for anybody who's an ex-Tiger. And it was in the history of the American West, particularly religion in the West. And I then went looking for a job after I finished my PhD in 1982, and the Air Force hired me. They have a civilian history program, mostly civilians. And I was hired into that program, working initially at the Military Airlift Command at Scott Air Force Base in the Command History Office. I did a couple of other tours at Ogden Air Logistics Center and Air Force Systems Command back when there was an Air Force Systems Command at Andrews Air Force Base in Maryland, and then right back to Scott, where I became the command historian. And that's why I'm here today, because I was a command historian. It coincided with the 40th anniversary of the Berlin Airlift. And as the historian, I was pretty heavily involved in planning activities associated with commemorating the airlift, as well as some historical studies associated with the airlift. And that's what I'm going to talk to you all about. After that, I moved to NASA in 1990 as the chief historian in Washington, D.C., spent 12 years there. And then I went to, I hope, everybody's favorite museum, notwithstanding the local Niagara Museum, the National Air and Space Museum in Washington, D.C., where I spent 15 years. The last part of that time is the associate director for Collections and Curatorial Affairs. It's a really fun gig. And I got to make a plug for it before I do anything else, because and sort of it coincided with the COVID pandemic. We had to redo all the downtown building. I mean, completely redo it. It was just coming apart on us. There was pieces of the exterior falling off. We were terribly concerned that it was going to fall off and hit a tourist. And so we ultimately had to take all of the artifacts out of the museum and do the work to update the building and recreate exhibitions after the fact. That is mostly done now. There's still some work being done on the east end of the building toward the Capitol, but the reality is a lot of it's now open. There's new envisioning of all kinds of exhibitions. One of my favorites, by the way, is one that we're calling Speed. And it deals not with just airplanes and spacecraft, but all kinds of other stuff. So Evel Knievel's motorcycles there. There's a bunch of fast cars and some other things like that. And then some of the coolest airplanes you've ever imagined, as well as the fastest spacecraft that have ever flown. Obviously not the real thing, because the real things don't come home. But but that's what we've been able to do. So I would encourage anybody who has a chance in the next year or two to go back to the Air and Space Museum in Washington and take a look around. I think you will be surprised and amazed at what's taking place here. That's a plug for the museum. But let's talk about the Berlin Airlift. So most of you are aware of it, at least at some level. And hope you all can see, sitting over here on the corner, I'm sort of in your way, but you know, I'll do what I can. And the clicker. Yeah, it's on. What am I missing? It's not just the clicker. Oh, there we go. Okay. Well, that's the first slide, so that's great. So this is sort of my game plan for tonight. I want to talk a little bit about air power. I want to talk about the blockade, the organizing the airlift and actually making it a reality, and ultimately ending up at the end of the airlift where it was a masterful success story. There's no way around thinking about that in that particular context. But I would make the case that this was an example of flexible air power like we had never seen previously. And that's an important lesson that comes out of the airlift. They didn't think in those terms in World War II and earlier than that, but after this, in the context of the early Cold War, we could now think of airlift as a critical element in the activities of the Cold War. And it's still not going. Am I doing something wrong? Take a look. I'll just talk to the slide briefly. So, you know, when I went through Air Command and Staff College for the Air Force, okay, it looks like it's working now. Great. Did I do something wrong?
I don't.
Okay. All right. Great.
Gremlin in the middle.
Whatever. I can't tell you how many engineering meetings I've been to where we spend 20 minutes getting the AV to work properly. So this may actually be a success story in that regard. You know, air power, I was always taught that there are like 5 components to it. You can add a couple if you wish to do so, but these are the 5 that really require airplanes. And the number one, by far, those of you who are associated with the Air Force know this well, strategic bombardment. And that became a critical component from the time of Billy Mitchell right through World War II and up to the present. In the immediate aftermath of World War II, the Strategic Air Command was born. The ability to deliver bombs internationally, and of course nuclear weapons internationally in that context, was a major component. And that's sort of the top of the line in terms of the missions of the Air Force. Second is air superiority. You know, sweeping the skies of enemy aircraft is a big deal. The fighters are a big piece of this, and you can see some World War II era airplanes flying here with a P-51 escorting them. That was very common in World War II, of course. And that is a critical component. We can't operate without that. Air interdiction, the hitting of targets beyond the immediate battlefield, trying to mess up the railroad lines and factories and various things of this nature, hitting the columns that are moving things forward on roads and bridges is a big piece of this. Fourth level is close air support, hitting things on the ground, close to combat troops on the ground, allowing them a better opportunity to be successful on a battlefield. And this is sort of in descending order in terms of the missions that the Air Force valued. And down here at the bottom is air supply, resupply activities, airlift. And it was not viewed, and still wasn't viewed at the time that I worked for the Military Airlift Command, as a mission that was highly prized. If you were going to be a pilot in the Air Force, you probably wanted to be a bomber pilot or a fighter pilot, and not so much these other things, and certainly usually not a transport pilot. Although I would contend that those were really significant missions and were more flexible than these other activities. And here you can see a C-47 with the D-Day markings on it from, and this is a recent picture, but it doesn't mean that it didn't date back to the 1940s. Aerial resupply was sort of the stepchild of air power. It had a purpose. Everybody recognized a purpose, but it sort of stood at the end of the line when it came to resources and stature as a military mission. Obviously, there was activities that were in a combat environment. Market Garden airdrop is one that I depicted here on the left-hand side. The D-Day airdrop, of course, is a significant part of this. The Hump Airlift is the first sort of strategic resupply mission of great stature during World War II. The movement of cargo and troops between India and China over the Himalayas. And that was a big deal and a very successful one in a lot of ways, but not without its faults and difficulties. There are numerous stories of air crews being lost in this, not always in the context of combat, although there was some of that, but also in the failure of aircraft as they're making a long haul from India to China. And there's a very fine book by Eric Severide. Some of you may remember Eric Severide, who was a war correspondent in World War II, who talks about flying over the hump. This is just one part of his memoir, flying over the hump in which they had to bail out. The airplane was going down, so they all ended up in the jungle for about 3 weeks, trying to get back out to Allied lines. Not an easy task, and it was a difficult one for him, as especially somebody who was a non-combatant and non-military. So, so there is some important examples during World War II of airlift operations. The one that comes closest to what we're going to talk about with Berlin is the Hump Airlift over the Himalayas. In the aftermath of World War II, Germany is divided up by the 4 Allied powers. And the Americans, the French, the English, and the Russians have a piece of it. They divide up the country, and they also divide up Berlin. And I wanted to show you this particular map because it shows the places in Berlin that were significant to the airlift later on. So what became East Berlin was in the Soviet sector. And we all know and have heard, and some of us may have actually been to Checkpoint Charlie and crossed into East Berlin during the Cold War, so you may have some personal experience with that. But the Soviet sector was cordoned off from the Allied efforts fairly quickly. The wall did not exist yet, but it would beginning in 1961. And then the 3 Western powers, the French sector up here, the British sector in the middle, and the American sector in the southern part of Berlin were sort of operated as a unit. Now, all of them in 1945 had a sort of an overarching military organization to oversee things, but very quickly, as relations between the Western Allies and the Soviet Union deteriorated, it became harder and harder for them to agree on much of anything. But it is significant for the airlift because Tempelhof Airport, still in existence today, no longer an active airport, but still there. You can go. In fact, it's mostly a park today. Can go there. Was the major airport in the city. It was built as a Hitler prestige project to show how modern and great Germany was. Gata Airport in the British sector and Tegel in the French sector become the 3 airports that are critical to the airlift operations in Berlin in 1948 and 49. So that's Berlin. This is just an image, and you can see the Brandenburg Gate here. Berlin was almost leveled during the war. I mean, they bombed the living daylights out of it, and you can see these bombed out buildings all through this area here, and it goes far beyond where this aerial shot is. To give you a sense of what the citizens of Berlin were dealing with in 1945 at the end of the war. So just like, oh, all right. Okay, just like the Berlin being divided up into zones, and you can see it is well located inside of the Soviet occupation zone in the eastern part of Germany. All of Germany is divided up by the four powers. So you've got the British here. I'm sorry, the Americans here, the French here, and the British up here. And they obviously in 1949 combined to create the Federal Republic of Germany, or West Germany as we call it. The Soviets obviously created East Germany almost immediately thereafter. But as soon as the Allies began to occupy Germany, there began to be tensions between the Russians and the Western Allies. Even before the fall of Germany, you find that these tensions are starting to arise anytime there is, especially American, but any of these Western powers meeting Russian troops, there's difficulties. And some of those difficulties are misunderstandings, and a lot of them are sort of staged in some way or another. And we see that at the Yalta Conference, they agreed that they were going to do this as a joint project. It didn't work out very well.
You have a laser in here.
Oh, I do?
Yeah.
Oh, maybe I should use that. Okay. Is that it? Yeah. Okay. So what precipitated directly the altercation over the Berlin blockade and ultimately the airlift began in the spring of 1948. And in the western part of Germany, what became West Germany, they introduced a new currency, the Deutschmark. And the British, the French, and the Americans agreed that this was going to be the currency there. This would solidify, and it was, of course, buttressed by the Allies' presence there in terms of keeping it a useful currency. This upset the Russians, who were not very happy about this. They were invited to be a part of it, but they didn't want to be. And they were afraid that this was going to destabilize their role in East Germany as well as in East Berlin. And by the way, it was. Most people in Germany wanted to be a part of this western part of this. And as a result of that, the Russians began to tighten the screws on Berlin. The idea was that if we can close it down, maybe we can force the other allies out of the city. And that's what they decided they were going to try to do. Fundamentally, this was a very important aggressive action, but it was not one in which there was going to be combat, at least not initially. And if there was going to be combat, the Americans were going to, or the Allies in the West were going to initiate it. That was sort of the idea. So they decided to close the border, the land movement between West Germany and Berlin. You had to cross through 100 miles or more of East German territory to get to West Berlin. If you close down the roads, what happens then? In 1948, the ground commander there said, well, we'll get an armored brigade and we'll just plow through the Autobahns and take it. But that would lead to war. They were convinced of that, and they were right. But there was a way to get around this, and this is where the airlift comes in. So the Russians decide to blockade Berlin. And so rail and truck transport was eliminated. They couldn't do that. But there was agreements on air paths from each of the sectors that the British, the French, and the Americans operated to fly into West Berlin. Only at 10,000 feet, but nonetheless, they had those corridors in place. So the next answer was, we've done this hump airlift in World War II. That worked pretty well. Maybe we can resupply, at least short term, West Berlin in this particular way. That was what resulted. So this is a map from 1948, and it's a significant map because of what they say is happening. And I'll read this to you because I'm sure you can't read it from where you are. So the Western powers say that the Berlin blockade was introduced with the object of establishing the exclusive domination of the Soviet Union and the Russian-dominated Socialist Unity Party, Communist Party in Berlin. They are occupying their sectors of Berlin as a matter of established right deriving from the defeat of Germany and confirmed by formal agreements among the principal allies. Blockade pressure must be removed before the future of Berlin and Germany as a whole can be discussed. They have taken this matter before the Security Council of the UN. That's what the Western powers say. On the other side, they've got, here's what the Soviet Union says. The Soviet Union says the Western governments have forfeited their right to be in Berlin because of their attempt to divide Germany by setting up a Western government. They also claim that the Western powers have not demilitarized their zones. The Ruhr has not been put under four-power control. Reparations have been interrupted, and that they have begun the dismemberment of Germany by discussion of provisional government and by making currency reforms in Western zones. Stalin declares that they are avoiding the agreement on Berlin. So basically, the Russians say the Americans and the French and the British have reneged on their deals about Berlin. The Western powers say the Russians are making it harder and harder to do anything together. So that's, both sides have a point. Both sides are arguing for themselves. Partly they're right and partly they're not. So the result of this was the airlift operations that began in June of 1948. The American effort flew out of Frankfurt, Rhein-Main Air Base, now part of Frankfurt International Airport. If you fly anywhere to Europe, you mostly have to change planes in Frankfurt if you're going anywhere. And so it's still a major hub. And flying out of Frankfurt, flying into Tempelhof. The same is true for British and French planes flying out of respective airports elsewhere. And initially, it was viewed as a short-term activity, an airlift that would last long enough to get a diplomatic solution. And I love this illustration. This is also from 1948. And I think it symbolizes better than almost anything else what Americans thought was happening in Germany at that particular point, and Eastern Europe as well. So here you can see Stalin, and basically he's taking over Europe. Everything in the East is becoming under the thumb of the Soviet Union. And what we see then is a series of actions, starting in with allies like Yugoslavia, but going into what is now the Czech Republic, Romania, Bulgaria, Poland, and so forth. Finland even trying to take control of Sweden. And this is the kind of map that came out. Have you heard of the domino theory? Probably a lot of you have. And basically, it was an argument made actually in 1947, in which a diplomat says, what we see is like you've got a row of dominoes that they're set up, and you click one down and the others start to fall. This is exactly what they're doing. As soon as they get near something, they take over. And then they want the next one. And then they want the next one. And then they want the next one. And this is Stalin's plan. By the way, Stalin had this map is very common in terms of looking at what we see happening in Europe in the 1945, 46, 47 timeframe. Stalin had his own map, and it was a polar projection looking down from the North Pole. And what he saw was the Soviet Union surrounded by everybody else that were American allies, and thinking they're the ones that are being encroached upon in this particular way. I think this map made a lot of sense from the standpoint of what the Americans are looking at in the late 1940s. The polar projection doesn't really say it to me in this quite the same way. But nonetheless, this led to this confrontation. Were we going to let them have Berlin? That's the bottom line. The Russians believed that without doing any military operations, without losing a person in the process, they could push the other allies out of Berlin by blockading the city. The Americans are not going to let that happen, but how do they respond? There were lots of people, including Truman as well, who said, you know, run an armored column through the Autobahns and just take over. But that would spark war. And the Russians were banking on the fact the Americans would not do that. And even if the Americans did do that, it would then look like war came, but it was the Americans' fault. Something they didn't want to have happen. And Berlin, from this point until the end of the Cold War, becomes the red hot point at which all of these controversies between the Americans and the Russians reach central point. There are more tanks in that region than anywhere else in Europe. There is more concern about what's taking place there than any other place in Europe throughout much of this period. And this is what makes the Berlin blockade so serious, and what prompted the response to airlift supplies there, because it's all about allowing the people of Berlin not to be starved out. This blockade was fundamentally a siege. That's what it was about. Siege. There's a long history of sieges in history, and this is one of them. So how do we on the Western Allies side, keep West Berlin from falling? The airlift is the result. So organizing the airlift, they decided they were going to do this in June. They began to fly at that particular point in time. Mostly they had C-46 aircraft at that point flying into Berlin, and they could haul in 1,000 tons a day. And that was okay at some level. But that's not going to sustain the population for very long. But how long do you really need to be? So here's a British magazine, Pathfinder magazine in 1948, that's talking about this. The firm of Uncle Sam and John Bull, flying grocers, kept the Western Allies in the battle for Berlin last week. Estimated by mid-July, there will be enough food in Berlin's stockpile to feed the 2 million Germans in western sectors of the capital until September 1st. Now, that's not really very long, but that's at least a start. Supplying fuel and coal will be another problem. And very quickly, they realized that coal is going to be a critical element through the winter. And so we've got to find ways to take that. And so here's kids who are sort of standing on the rubble looking at the airplanes, as they will. Here's some more Berliners down there watching an airliner come in a little bit later on as it is engaged in the airlift. So they organized this effort, flying out of Rhein-Main, Frankfurt, and other places, in and out. There's 3 corridors. You can see the corridors here. And the idea was to fly in on these 2 corridors, fly out on the center corridor, and then back to base. And it's all about sort of the rhythm of airlift, making these things fly as quickly and efficiently as possible, and they were not good at it going in. After being into it by only about a month, in July of 1948, the National Security Council in DC is looking at this saying, we're not going to be able to sustain this. We're talking about probably requiring 4,500 tons of cargo per day to do this if we want to carry this on. Now, we can do this for a little while, but the reality is when bad weather hits, and it will in Germany, there's no doubt about that. Those of you who've flown there in the winter know what I'm talking about. That we can't sustain the level of activity that we're doing in the summer, and it's going to become a real problem. This is a little bit later in the airlift. The picture that you can see is Tempelhof with aircraft lined up being unloaded on the tarmac. So they really had to plan to do this over the winter and ultimately indefinitely. So here's a comparison chart. They're doing this mostly with C-47, some C-46s. And in terms of trips, you know, for a C-47, you're going to need 39,000 trips to deliver 4,500 tons. I mean, that's sort of the, I'm starting to trip over the thing here. Let me get back behind the podium. Flying times involved as well. A lot of flying time because these airplanes fly at a slower speed. A lot of crews, 1,700 crews with C-47s. Number of aircraft, you know, 899 aircraft to sort of sustain this activity of 4,500 tons. C-54 is a smaller number. C-74s, which are just starting to come into the inventory, a much smaller amount of that. Maintenance crews and gasoline and total crew operations suggested that the C-47s and World War II era airplanes were probably not the way to get this done long term. And most of the airplanes that were flown in this were ultimately C-54s. They have more cargo capability. They operate faster. They can be handled more effectively, and maintenance on them is easier. And this is where William Tunner comes into the picture. Everybody heard of him before? Some of you? Okay. So Tunner was first and foremost a logistician. He was the mastermind of the hump airlift in World War II, which was a successful operation. Nothing approaching the level of activity that we see with the Berlin Airlift, but he had some serious experience, and he thought about this pretty significantly. And he's brought in toward the end of summer in 1948 to run this thing. And he's got a philosophy about this. He's thought through this thing pretty thoroughly in terms of how to do these sorts of things. And he wrote a memoir about this, by the way, called Over the Hump, which you can get with no trouble at all. The Air Force republished it a few years ago. There's hard copies out there. It's also available online if you want it for free. But you know, he said this about these airlifts. There's no frenzy, no flap, just the inexorable process of getting the job done. In a successful airlift, you don't see planes parked all over the place. They're either in the air or are loading or unloading on ramps or being worked on. That's it. That's all they do. And the real excitement of running a successful airlift, he writes, comes from seeing a dozen lines climbing steadily on a dozen charts. Tonnage delivered, utilization of aircraft, and so on. And the lines representing accidents and injuries going sharply down. That's where the glamour lies in air transport, which is also, by the way, where a lot of people didn't like it all that much, because it's not about being Maverick and Top Gun. It's an entirely different approach to flying in it, but it's significant and much, I would contend, underestimated by some segments in the Air Force community. So Tunner reorganizes the airlift. He makes a number of decisions about how we're going to go about doing this. And some of them are really important, and I want to draw attention to this map again. We've sort of seen this. We're flying, you know, out of Frankfurt into Tempelhof. You come in and land right here, and you spend whatever time is necessary on the ground, but much should be less time than you ever thought, and then back out and around. The other parts of the airlift did similar sorts of things, but one of the first decisions was we're doing this only with instrument flight rules. We're not, no VFR whatsoever. Everybody is going to fly in a certain way, at a certain speed, at a certain altitude, and he set it up like this. It's maybe hard to see. So this is 3-minute intervals between airplanes, 5 levels of airplanes flying in altitude, starting at 5,000 feet. And between them, each in the same altitude, 15 minutes difference in terms of one airplane flies at 5,000 feet, the next one launches 15 minutes later, and they continue just like that. It's a conveyor belt. That's the way in which you could characterize it. And so from Frankfurt to Berlin, you've got planes coming in every 3 minutes, landing, taking off every 3 minutes. But in terms of the altitude at which they fly, it's 15 minutes apart. Does that make sense? Okay. And that worked beautifully. 24/7. That was the plan. Obviously, there were some weather conditions where you couldn't do that, but that was the objective. They were able to eliminate a lot of the weather conditions in that context, except for really, really bad storms, by doing IFR. And the ground controllers, were absolutely critical to all of this. So without all these teams working effectively, and I haven't said anything about the maintenance crews that are operating as well. At the same time, they all have to operate on this clock, and it was all about the movement of this on a timely basis. So they reduced the unloading times from 17 minutes at the start of the airlift to 5 minutes during the Tunner era, and that's really impressive. And as I said a moment ago, 100% IFR. That's the approach to Tempelhof, by the way. And pilots who flew this told me that when you're going in final approach, you're down basically, you're as low as the apartment buildings that you're flying past, and you can see people out the window and stuff. But they were successful in delivering that 4,500 tons a day. So I have to tell you about Gale Halverson. Most of you have heard of him, I think, I hope. He is a legend in a whole lot of ways. So Gale Halverson was from Utah. He was a C-54 pilot. He had experience toward the end of World War II. He lived a long time. He just died a couple of years ago, over 100. And this is him in 1948 during the airlift. And he was taken by the fact that whenever he came in to land at Tempelhof, he saw all these kids who were down watching them. And he was struck by that. And wouldn't it be fun to sort of engage them in some way? And initially, he, until I told him he couldn't do this anymore, he would try to go out to the fence where they were and talk to them, pass some candy bars and whatever else. But then he decided to take a handkerchief and make a parachute, and tie a candy bar to it and push it out a little chute that he had there for a flare, and drop them as they would go in. And he told me, he said, I was afraid that I was going to get into trouble. And lo and behold, after I did this a couple of times, I got back to Rhine-Main, and I was called into Hunter's office, and he says, I knew I was just going to be chewed out like mad. You can't do this kind of stuff. You're going to create a riot or something. And they told him, hey, this was a really cool thing to do. We really like this. The people in Berlin love it. The kids love it. It's got the excitement of people in America. And so they turned it into a publicity activity. And he started getting candy bars and parachutes from the U.S. And here they are on his bed. He's got some of this stuff here, and he's getting them ready to do this. And so he told the kids that when he came in for a landing, they would know it was him because he would waggle his wings. And so when that happened, then they had a sense of when the schedule was, and they sort of knew what was taking place. And so they would all kind of rush out there, and he would drop these things. And he had friends who were doing it for him in the back of the plane and so forth. But he became famous, as the candy bomber, because he's delivering this to these kids. And it opened a connection to him and the people of Berlin that was very close for the rest of his life. And here he is in 1989 at the time of the 40th anniversary. At that point, I was the Military Airlift Command's command historian, and we had a formal tattoo ceremony, a formal retreat ceremony, and he was a featured guest because he was a very famous pilot who had been associated with the airlift, and so he came, and there he is, looking out the window of a plane. I got to know him reasonably well. A little bit later that year, at this point, he was working for BYU in Provo, Utah. And he was like the assistant dean of students. And now, and by the way, later on in his military career, he gets sent back to Berlin as the commander at Tempelhof for a time. And so he had these close connections with people in the city. And I was going to BYU to participate in a conference on World War II and Utah. And Gale found out I was coming, and he calls me up and he says, "Come and stay with me and my wife." So I did. And it was a remarkable experience. I mean, just such a wonderful human being. I mean, no question about that. And we happened to be there, and the conference happened to be taking place during the first day when the wall started to come down. And we had both been to the conference all day. And we came back to his home from BYU, and his wife says, "You got to see what's going on." And so we sat down, we started watching this on television, and he sat there and wept. It was such a emotional experience for him as he sees these people, break holes in that wall and come through and stand up on top of it and dance and sing. It was a remarkable, remarkable experience. And it was so moving for him in ways that it never could be for me. But watching him, was a really emotional experience for me too. Gale Halverson, an unbelievably significant person who did something terrific at the time of the Berlin Airlift. So the airlift continues through the winter. It looks like there's no let up in what the Americans are doing. The Russians decide to do everything they can to distract pilots. Shine spotlights in the faces as the airplanes are coming in. Buzz them with Soviet fighters. Shoot off things nearby, not at the planes, but making noise, maybe thinking that they're being attacked. And none of that, with the hope that they would disrupt this in some particular way, that there would be accidents, that there would be fatalities as a result of that. None of that came to fruition. And they got through the winter time frame being successful at delivering this 4,500 tons a day, most of which was not food, most of which was fuel, and especially coal, because they were trying to get it in for the to fuel furnaces there. And William Tunner decides that he's going to try the Easter parade. So on Easter Sunday, April 16th of 1949, they begin a 24-hour effort to deliver more cargo than had ever been delivered before. Tunner had said all along, what I want to see is a plane landing every minute of every day. And that is 1,440 minutes. So 1,440 planes. Never was able to do that. But they were going to try that for the Easter parade. Weren't able to do it earlier than that. They didn't get that far. They got 1,398 successful flights in, not 1,440, but pretty close. And were able to deliver 12,941 tons of food and some other supplies on that 24-hour period. That's pretty remarkable. So at the end of this, a Colonel William Bunker, who was a transportation officer working for the Air Force at the time, put the effort in perspective. He told Tunner, and I quote for you, "You guys have hauled the equivalent of 600 cars of coal into Berlin today. Have you ever seen a 50-car coal train? Well, you just equaled 12 of them." It's a pretty remarkable success. The Russians, when they saw this, they realized that they weren't going to be able to defeat them. They could do this, not at this level, but certainly at the level to sustain the 2 million people in Berlin pretty much indefinitely. And so they were looking for, at that point, a diplomatic solution. And that led to a set of discussions about reopening the ground transportation capabilities and cutting and ending the blockade, which they did. So this is the last flight. You can see the air crew is written on their last Fiddles flight. 17,835,727 tons airlifted to Berlin during the course of the year. So from June 24th to May 12th, and that was the last flight, it was a very impressive operation, delivering a lot of tonnage to Berlin, demonstrating that they could do this as long as they needed to. The Combined Airlift Task Force that was involved in this, by this time, was almost all C-54s. The earlier planes that had started the airlift were cycled out of the effort. There was obviously the RAF with some other aircraft flying out of the northern part of West Germany. They also did amphibious landings in the summer time frame when they could land on the rivers there. But the reality was, it was mostly, I shouldn't say mostly, that would upset our colleagues who were working on the other side. It was in no small measure an American effort. And as a result of that, the Russians decided that they needed to negotiate a settlement. They did so in May of 1949, and Berlin never was blockaded at all after that during the war. So this is my question. So I always ask, so what? At the end of anything that you talk about in history, you need to ask the question, so what? Why is this important? I got a few reasons. So it was significant, first and foremost, as a foreign policy and foreign relations effort. It demonstrated that we could do things to support Berlin that were short of war. And we're able to use airlift as a diplomatic tool. This was the first instance, but a whole lot more followed, in which military airlift was used for very constructive and important purposes throughout the history of the Cold War. It ended the blockade without a shot being fired, in which nobody died, at least not intentionally. It impressed the Soviet Union. They recognized that at no time could they undertake anything like this. And probably there's very few that could do it even today. They demonstrated that virtually any amount of cargo that they needed to carry, they could carry and engage in these particular activities. And then lastly, and most important in my mind, Air Force Magazine made a comment in September of 1948 that its most important legacy was, and I'll quote for you, "For the first time in history, the United States is employing its Air Force as a diplomatic weapon." That's absolutely true. You can do a lot with bombers and fighters and other types of airplanes, but it usually involves combat in some form or another. This did not involve combat, but we've got what we wanted out of the situation that was in place there. With that, I'm going to close, and we'll go from there. Yeah.
Any notion for the number of stories that are doing?
Yeah. Oh, okay. All right. The question was about the number of sorties. Usually they were doing 2, sometimes 3, but they were bringing in lots of new air crews as well. So they were scheduled that way. And, and the flight in and out was, an hour and a half each way, basically. So you could do a couple. And more during the Easter parade. I mean, this is a maximum effort. Everybody's going to fly all day. What else?
Curtis LeMay was the overall air boss of the operation. And there couldn't be more divergent personality.
That's absolutely true.
Was there any tension?
Yeah. So the question was about LeMay and the tension that he did have. There's no question about that with Tunner. LeMay was sort of, let's go bomb these guys, basically. Let's take them out. And at some point, you sort of sympathize with that. They were a thorn in the side for 40 years of what was taking place in Europe. And but Tunner had a different type of mission, and he was obviously, at this point, he was a 2-star, and he wasn't going to argue forcefully with a 4-star general. So, anybody else? Yeah.
All those flights, no accidents you went?
No, there were accidents. Yeah, usually they were minor. There weren't fatalities, but there were accidents, and there was a couple of air crews that had to bail out, and there were a few instances where they had crippled planes that sort of staggered back to the west. Yeah.
Talk about no misapproach.
Oh, yeah, right. Yeah.
What prompted that?
Yeah, and so, right. So that particular instant, this was about missed approaches. At one point, Tunner flies to Berlin and he sees all these airplanes circling, and that's not the way to do business. I mean, they need to come in, they need to land, they need to unload, and they need to get out of there as quickly as possible. And he shut the operation down at that particular point for a few hours until they could sort of sort it all out. And so the resulting decision was, that's a very passive voice thing. He made the decision. If you miss the approach, you turn around and come back with your cargo. You don't hang around there and try to get into the line again. No go arounds. You're going to come back out. You're going to land in Frankfurt or wherever the other base is, or whatever base you came from, and then you're going to get back into the system and go back later. And that they never had that problem again, not in the same way. There were a few instances where some people couldn't get in when they were supposed to. They turned around and came right back. Don't fly over the airspace here and clog up everybody else. Yeah. You know, I wish I knew the answer to that. Somebody may have done some analysis of that. I've never seen it. And partly, I guess my answer to that would be, who cares? I mean, we're doing this for strategic purposes. It's going to cost. I hate it when somebody said it already. It's going to cost what it costs. I've heard so many people at like NASA say that it costs what it costs. And it does at some level, but I don't know what it was. Yeah, right. Well, they did fly back to more than one airport. It depends on where they deployed from. The American deployment was out of Rhein-Main, which is now Frankfurt, and in those days it was a shared runway. I mean, it was the international airport and the air base as well. But if you flew out of one of the other airports, or one of the other bases in the French or the British sector, you went back to those. So, anybody else?
Online. I'll
Yeah.
just let you read it out loud to everyone and then attempt to answer.
All right. Oh, it's Kevin. Okay. If I understand correctly, didn't the United States also impose economic sanctions against East Germany? What impact did the sanctions have in addition to the airlift? And was this one of the first modern economic wars to force policy such as we are using with Iran and Korea today? That's a really good question. Yeah, there were economic sanctions, and the reality was that it was more with East Germany than with Berlin, but they were trying to force the other side to sort of end this thing. It didn't prove successful until they finally were able to demonstrate beyond all reasonable doubt that they could sustain this operation forever. And Kevin's absolutely right about the economic sanctions and its role since that time in terms of being a part of the diplomatic solution to any controversy. And we're seeing it routinely today. Yeah.
Detention of the Soviet Union. Was it before the population was starved out, the Western powers abdicate responsibility for Western?
Yeah. So it was about what the East Germans were trying to do and the Soviet Union was trying to do in this context. And basically, and you made the point, and you're quite right. Starve out the American and French and British piece of this and force them to abandon Berlin, in which case the Russians would take over the whole city. And this was not acceptable on the Allied side. We have to maintain a presence there. It's symbolic, if nothing else. And so they did that. They maintained that divided city then until the end of the Cold War. And I told you the story about the wall coming down in '89, effectively ending that sort of division in Germany. Yeah, but you're right. Yeah.
I remember reading something, and I don't know if this was in a novel or an actual history of the Berlin Airlift, but it was about the difficulty of flying coal, that they said the coal dust would clog up the airplane and the flight controls and so forth. Can you talk to things like that and
sure.
how they got around it?
Sure. Well, I mean, there's obviously several pieces that, the coal dust was a real problem. So they initially just started trying to put coal in bags, burlap bags. That didn't work at all because the dust would just come out and get all over the plane and gum up the works, get into the gears, get into every part of the mechanical equipment that was there. And so this was a big part of the overhauls that they had to do early on. They found better bags over time to put this stuff in, which eliminated most of it, but they never solved the problem altogether. And quite frankly, it's still an issue. I mean, you've seen these coal barges going up and down rivers or wherever they happen to be, and you walk into any one of them, there's going to be coal dust all over the place. And there's essentially no way around that. You can do some things to mitigate it, but it's a problem. I have to put on my NASA hat for just a minute and tell you there was a similar problem with the astronauts going to the moon and the lunar lander. The lunar dust, which is very, very fine. Some people sort of think of it like sand, but it wasn't. It's much, much more fine. Buzz Aldrin told me it was sort of like talcum powder. And it just got into everything. It got into the workings in the lunar module. It got into the joints where they fitted the gloves to the suits, things like that. And it was hard to get out, and they had to try to figure out a way to do it. And this is going to be a challenge moving forward for NASA's efforts to try to do more things on the lunar surface, because that's going to still be an issue. Yeah.
What's the number of crew for?
It depended on the aircraft. I'm sorry. He asked what the number of the crew was for the aircraft. Pilot, co-pilot, navigator. There's probably at least somebody in the back who was a load master of some type. Beyond that, I couldn't tell you.
Flight engineer for?
Probably was. You're probably right.
The supplies, where did they come from?
Okay, so the question was about the supplies. Well, they came from everywhere. Mostly they came from Europe in various places. There might have been some cargo that was brought from the United States, but if we're talking about food and coal and things of this nature, that can be sourced from the western part of Europe. And so that's what they ended up doing most of the time. There was a few luxury items that came from elsewhere, and each of the airlift groups, French, British, American, were supplying these materials. And that's a part of the cost that you were asking about earlier. And how much they spent, I don't know. Yes? It was, so this was about distribution on the ground. So the airlifters, of course, were less concerned about that. Most of the people that were doing the unloading were locals, citizens of Berlin, and they had distribution centers in the city. They would take things there. They made it available either for free in some instances or at a very limited cost. And I mean, this is, as I've said before, this was a city under siege. Most of the economic activities in the city are sort of mostly at a standstill during this time. So it was also a humanitarian crisis as much as anything else. So distribution is more important than sales, but they moved it to all kinds of places. Yes. Receive what? Not direct. Okay, it was about ground fire. There was fire, not at the aircraft themselves. They'd fire off some anti-aircraft and some things like this, sort of in the vicinity, but not aimed into the flight path of the aircraft. Small arms? Yeah, there's no instance that I saw anywhere in the record of somebody shooting at the plane with a rifle or something like that. May have happened, but I'm not aware of it. The Russians did, of course, fire anti-aircraft to sort of scare the pilots and get them to deviate from their path and so forth. Yes? So the Soviets did try to jam things for a while. That was defeated by switching channels and with better systems put into place over time.
How long did it take to turn the supply lines back up? Rail and road?
Okay, I'll do this and I'll come over to you. So the question was about turning back on the supply system. The negotiations started in June. They were working to set that moving forward while they're doing the negotiations. They knew it was over. And within a couple of weeks, they had that up and running and it was working just fine. And, it's basically about getting the rolling stock back in operation. It was checking the railroad lines to make sure you could operate on them. They hadn't fallen into disrepair. The Autobahns were there and they knew what those were like.
And also they continued the airlift even after the blockade technically ended for a period of time.
For a period of time, just to make sure they had stuff.
Period.
Yeah. All right, there was something else back there. Yeah.
Like Nuremberg, they leveled that.
Yeah.
They fly planes in.
Well, that was not a part of the Berlin airlift. Yeah, well, they had all of it. I mean, Nuremberg was in the East Germany. I'm not sure I understand. So it was only into Berlin, and they were, and the airlift was only operating in there and in the west side, not the eastern side. Presumably, the eastern side was being fed and cargo was brought in normally, as it would be, from East Germany. And that would be true for any city that was in the East German part of the area. Not with this, no. I mean, they were trying to force out the Americans and the French and the Brits, so they weren't helping. That's for sure. They had laid siege to the city with the intention of forcing its capitulation to become a part of the Eastern Bloc, and that's what they wanted. But they didn't achieve that end.
Part of the plan to cause an uprising. People who want to join East Germany.
Yeah, I've never. So this is a good question. The question was about whether or not was this a strategic plan on the part of the Russians to force the West Germans to basically rebel against the Allies who were overseeing West Berlin. I never saw anything that's associated in that particular way. And quite frankly, the West Germans were united in their effort on this. They hated the Russians. They probably hated them before they got into Berlin, but clearly after what was going on there, they didn't have a whole lot of sympathy for them. And since the Americans and the French and the British were doing all that they could to resupply, they didn't have any impetus at all to try to overthrow that regime. Yeah.
And absorbed by the Soviets when it was.
Well, so it was about why wasn't Berlin just occupied by the Soviets in its entirety at the end of the war? And the reason for that is because it was the capital of Berlin and therefore incredibly significant for the history and welfare of Germany. And Berlin, they had made an agreement at the Yalta Conference that we're going to divide that into 4 zones, one under the occupation of each of the four combatants. The Russians obviously was one of those. The French, the Americans, and the British were the other three, and they had governance over those individual sectors. And the Western Allies, the ones that ended up running the Berlin Airlift, sort of cooperated very well with each other and maintained a lot of commonality with how they were doing things. The Russians, very early on, were obstinate about how they were going to govern things, and things went from bad to worse in late 1945 and 46 and into 47.
Thought that plan was gonna work until it was defeated by Soviet occupation.
Yes, they did. So the Western Allies were definitely not going to allow this to be successful. And it raises the interesting what if question. Historians call them counterfactual questions. It's sort of what if something had happened differently. If the Berlin blockade, if the Berlin airlift had not been successful in sort of sustaining the city through the winter, what would the Western Allies have done? Would they have capitulated and left the city, leaving it to East Germany and to the Russians? I doubt it very much. I think that they might have at that point sent an armored column in to sort of open up the Autobahns, and it probably would have led to combat, maybe in a very significant way. But you know, the fortunate thing is both sides sort of recognized in 1948 that the Western Allies could sustain this airlift, and that the Russians were weaker than they might have thought they were, and they had a weaker hand in the strategic issue than they thought they did initially, and they realized that they weren't going to win this. So ultimately, it's a diplomatic solution. They decide that they're going to agree to do something about this and operate it as a joint effort.
Well, Russia had
Yeah, well, that's right. So the question was about, did Russians have nukes at that time? They did not. They exploded their first atomic bomb in 1949, so just, you know, a little while after this. And they could have obviously used those later on. Fortunately, nobody did on either side, or Lord knows what might have come of it. But that was a serious question. But the Americans had nukes, and they had deployed B-29 bombers to Europe just for the purpose of using them in this particular context, had they done so, had they needed to.
there American
Yeah, well, there was, so air traffic control, absolutely. Ground control approach was a critical element, and that all based in Berlin. There was some maintenance capability there, but you didn't want to service them there if there was any way to avoid it. So, and they opened up depots out in what became West Germany, just for the purpose of servicing those aircraft. And so most of the maintenance was done out there. The last thing that you want is an airplane sort of stuck on the ground at Tempelhof or someplace like that while it's being serviced. You want to get it out of there if it's flyable at all. All right. I guess we're done. Thank you all.
Oh, you need to come.
Okay.
It's a tradition here to give the speaker at the Aero Club a winged buffalo.
Oh my.
And this is your buffalo, and it's got your name on the side.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah.
And
Really heavy.
And it's heavy.
It's heavy, and
Okay.
you can pretty much probably kill a few people with that if you have a fight. Yes, airlifted.
And it will be tomorrow morning.
Yeah, yeah. It'll certainly add to your weight and balance, I'm
Yeah,
sure.
oh, that's great. Thank you.
Yes, well, thank you very much. And it's been a wonderful talk. Thank you very much for coming. Thank you. That's great. And thank you very much for everybody coming here tonight.
The next Aero Club meeting won't be until September. I don't know the date in September, but it's usually the third Thursday of the month. And there are all these other things happening in the summer now. And so go to the